Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to learn a little bit more about the Unified Budget recommendations. Recommendations will be finalized in the next couple of weeks and presented to the Board of Trustees at their July 18 meeting in Bangor. Since the initial recommendations were released in mid-May, we received feedback requesting additional details on how the proposed new funding model would actually work. Many of the details are still a work in progress and will be finalized only after meetings with key stakeholders throughout the fall. However, we developed a short presentation to answer some of the larger questions that we do know today, like what type of metrics is the group considering? What do we mean by parity funding? How would new funding flow into the model, and how would it be distributed across the campuses? Again, there are a lot of decisions that have yet to be made, but hopefully this short video will provide you with insight into the group's thinking. It's hard to talk about the benefits of the new funding model without noting the issues with our current allocation method. Largely unchanged for almost 50 years, the current methodology is based on a fixed percentage of the appropriation going to each campus, regardless of changes in enrollment or programming. In fiscal year 14, the University of Maine system implemented an outcomes-based funding formula layered over the existing methodology. Today, OBF represents 20% of the allocation distributed to the campuses. The model recommended by the chief business officers would completely transition to a new allocation model beginning in FY19. We believe that the funding model should be based on the different institutional missions. Rather than simply allocating based on a fixed percentage, the new model calculates the resources necessary to support an institution's E&G mission and size with an expected state appropriation at each campus. This estimate is referred to as the mission resource requirement. The mission resource requirement accounts for the complexities and operating needs that are affected not only by student enrollment, but also by other factors like student level and the type of academic programs offered. The new funding model recognizes the cost needed to support E&G expenses across institutional missions and also recognizes that these costs are shared by students and the state. Out-of-state students are expected to pay the full cost through tuition and fees. For in-state students, it is a shared responsibility of the state and the student. The model will recommend operating levels to provide support in each of the broad categories as recommended by the CBOs. Currently, those categories include instruction, research and public service, academic and library support, facilities, and administration. While the model will recommend a total need for E&G costs, it will also clearly state what the expectation for state support is to be part of that total cost. I'll briefly touch on the areas the CBOs are currently recommending be part of the model. The details in each area will be developed in the coming months with stakeholder and campus input. One of the first areas the model will look at is instruction. As noted in the slide, instructional costs will vary by campus mission and be based in part on agreed upon peer data. The slide includes some of the metrics the team is considering. In each of the areas, the chief business officers will identify stakeholders and work with them to establish the correct metrics and accessible data to support those metrics. The CBOs are recommending that UMS engage a third party to determine peer institutions and then vet the data through campus stakeholders. The University of Maine system, through our universities, carries out the traditional tripart mission: teaching, research, and public service. The chief business officers endorsed that mission and wanted to make sure that the recommendations that are used to develop the new funding model enhance the research and public service work our campuses do across the state of Maine. One method the CBOs are exploring is building into the model a metric that will build a fixed percentage of the prior year's expenditures in public service and research into the campus's proposed allocation. This would have the impact of incentivizing expansion. As research or public service dollars at the campus level increase, the model will recommend additional allocations to cover the additional costs associated with research or public service expansion. The CBOs are recommending that library and student services also be included as major cost components of the new funding model. We're proposing to use peer data and IPEDS data to determine an appropriate allocation methodology, and will again compare that against institutional peers to support the unique missions of our campuses. We're also recommending that the funding be partially based on student population, recognizing economies of scale in the model. Facilities costs are a significant part of the budgets at each of our campuses. The new model will include a component that identifies the relevant metrics for facilities. Potential metrics might include building maintenance costs, custodial services, ground maintenance, and utilities. The CBOs will work with facilities staff and already existing sightlines data to advance facilities goals as outlined by the Board of Trustees. Administration includes costs which are non-instructional in nature but are integral to the operation of the institutions. Examples might include institutional and academic administration. The approach recommended by the CBOs is a fixed percentage of the allocation recommended for instructional, library and student services, and facilities. The chief business officers will use identified peer and IPEDS data to determine the appropriate allocation metrics and methods. We've discussed 7 potential cost centers on the previous slides. For each cost center, the model will recommend the operating funds necessary for each campus. All of those components will roll up to present the total resources necessary to adequately support the approved mission of each of our institutions. The model will recommend a total, as well as the percentage suggested for state support. As previously mentioned, out-of-state students are expected to support the full cost of their education through tuition and fees. State appropriation subsidizes the full cost for in-state students. While the model will calculate a total need for E&G operational costs, the resulting calculation will include recommended state allocations to support in-state students only. To help illustrate how the model might work, we'll show a campus with some hypothetical numbers and then show that campus as part of a larger system and how new resources will impact the funding levels as proposed by the Chief Business Officer. Here's a hypothetical campus with recommended allocations by cost center. The model in this case is suggesting that in order to adequately fund the mission of this campus, they have a total need in instruction of $122.5 million. For research, the model suggests an allocation of slightly more than $9 million in E&G support. This calculation is run for each of the cost centers, and a total campus operating need is determined for each campus. Recall in an earlier slide, we noted the model supports the concept that out-of-state students are paying the full cost of their education. In this case, out-of-state tuition and fee revenue is deducted in line 9 above. A much smaller student portion of in-state revenues is also deducted. In this case, the model is recommending a state allocation of approximately $118.5 million for this campus. We'll repeat this exercise for each campus, changing the peer groups that are relevant to each campus's mission. As mentioned previously, one of the challenges we have today is that the allocations have largely been determined by fixed percentages for more than 50 years. This has created significant imbalances in funding levels between our 7 campuses. The chief business officers are unanimous in their support for a funding model that allows each campus the opportunity to be successful. To achieve that goal, we're recommending that the recommended funding levels in the model be compared against the actual state appropriation at each campus. Ideally, campuses would be funded at 100% of that level, although that is unlikely to be the case in the near future, given those imbalances previously mentioned, in addition to limited increases in state appropriations in recent years. Let's look at how that might work with a campus we referenced in the previous slides. Recall the total operating needs suggested by the model for our hypothetical campus was about $118.5 million. Let's compare that to the actual state appropriation for the campus. We'll refer to our hypothetical campus as Campus G in this example. While the model suggested a state appropriation of $118.5 million, in this example the campus is actually underfunded based on their approved mission. On the far right, you'll see the actual state appropriation is less than $60 million. Campus G is receiving 50% of the recommended funding level as suggested by the model. As previously mentioned, we'll perform this calculation for each campus. In the top left, you see hypothetical funding levels at 6 other campuses. Looking closer, you see Campus G is being funded at 50% of their recommended level, with other campuses spaced above or below that. Campus D, in this case, is clearly underfunded based on the approved mission of their campus, by 6 percentage points under the next two closest campuses. The goal of the CBOs is to provide more equitable funding across the entire University of Maine system. As we referenced just a few slides ago, we feel we achieve that by providing parity in state appropriation. In this case, parity is measured by comparing actual state funding received to the amount recommended by the funding model. An equitable distribution of state resources is achieved when the state's share of funding is at the same percent of the recommended funding formula at each of the campuses of the University of Maine system. Using the examples from this slide, initially parity would be achieved when each campus was funded at 65% of their recommended operating costs. Here, the level that Campus E is funded at. To achieve that parity, we are not recommending that campuses' funding be lowered to bring it to par with others. That would simply create budget gaps, also a stated goal of the CBOs to eliminate. We're recommending that as new dollars are appropriated to the system by the legislature and the governor, they first be allocated to those campuses funded well below their recommended levels. In our hypothetical example above, the initial first step would be moving Campus D to parity with the next set of campuses. In this case, Campus A and Campus F funded at 43%. Dollars would then be allocated to those campuses still funded below others. In our example here, that would mean bringing campuses A, D, and F up to the 50% level, bringing them to par with our hypothetical Campus G from the previous slides. As funding flows into the system, we continue to strive towards parity across the system by now moving those underfunded campuses up to the next level, in this case moving to 53%, the levels of funding for campuses B and C. At this point, we will have 6 campuses funded at 53% of their recommended operating costs. The standout in our example continues to be Campus E, funded at 65%. We finally achieved the goal of equitable funding when the 6 campuses funded at 53% are funded at levels that bring them up to 65% of their approved mission. And from there, as new dollars are allocated to the system, they're distributed in a way that continues to fund campuses in a more equitable manner. Now, it's important to note the numbers above are hypothetical. Ultimately, when the calculations are performed, campuses would be closer or further apart in the actual distributions. Also, the numbers we've used here remain static throughout the slides. In other words, because calculations are done annually, it's possible that a campus could be funded at 50% of their recommended funding level in year 1, but when the model is run the next year, operating costs have gone up at a rate higher than the actual state appropriation. So maybe in year 2, that campus is only funded at 48%, for example. It's also important to note the obvious. It is likely that in order to achieve parity, it may, in fact would likely, take multiple rounds of state appropriations. That will depend on the mix of campuses and where they fall after calculations are determined. In other words, if the 3 campuses funded at the lowest levels were also the 3 smallest campuses, parity would be more easily attained than if our 2 largest campuses were the most underfunded. In those examples, it would likely take longer to achieve parity. I hope this has been helpful in providing some additional insight into the recommendations from the Chief Business Officers. As a reminder, these recommendations will be presented to the Board of Trustees at their July 18th meeting.